Hey everyone, welcome to the Smart Economy Podcast, a production of neonewstoday.com. I'm your host, Dylan Grabowski. In this episode, we're joined by Alexei Zamyatin, the co-founder of Build on Bitcoin, or BOB, a Bitcoin Layer 2 solution. In this conversation, we discussed how BitVM is empowering building in the Bitcoin ecosystem, how Bitcoin and Ethereum mutually benefit one another, Bitcoin's developer renaissance, bridging solutions and their trust assumptions, forthcoming Bitcoin-enabled applications, Bitcoin's existential questions, and so much more. Just a reminder, nothing said on this podcast is a solicitation to buy or sell any tokens, and that the guest or host may hold tokens discussed in any given episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review it on your favorite podcasting platform and share it with your friends and family. Every rate, review, like, and comment really helps us get this in front of more ears and eyes. With all that said, I really enjoyed speaking with Alexei, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation too. Hey everyone, welcome to the Smart Economy Podcast. Today we're joined by Alexei, the co-founder of Build on Bitcoin, which we will be calling BOB, a hybrid L2 chain that combines Bitcoin security with the programmability of Ethereum. Alexei, super psyched to chat with you today. How you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Yes. So I've been really excited to just delve into the wonderful world of building in the Bitcoin ecosystem. And I think that BOB is doing some really great things in combining two of the best kind of forces that are out there with the two blue chip ecosystems, Bitcoin and Ethereum. So to kind of get the conversation started with BOB and with the way that you're building and with the communities and assets you're trying to connect, what's more of a powerful driver for BOB? Is it Bitcoin's kind of still, hodled $2 trillion in liquidity? Or is it this programmability in smart contract driven DeFi verticals that are in Ethereum land?
So naturally, I think the driving factor for growth will be Bitcoin, but not just the $2 trillion market cap, but Bitcoin's distribution and very diverse and global community, very old community that stretches through not only almost every Web3 startup, whether it's an exchange and has been around for ages like Coinbase or Kraken, or a new startup, but also far beyond our crypto ecosystem, into institutions, into big businesses, banks, merchants. So that, I think, is Bitcoin's superpower. It has distribution. It is by now mainstream, right? We all recall when everybody was hating on Bitcoin for its proof of work and the energy consumption, it suddenly stopped. Well, because now the banks are selling you the ETF. So I think that is Bitcoin's hidden superpower. It has a brand. And if you think of, I love to make a comparison with Apple. When you see the Apple logo, right, you know exactly what it stands for. And they spend billions of dollars to get there. Bitcoin's already there. Everybody knows Bitcoin. So that's basically Bitcoin's hidden power for growth. But for bootstrapping, and that's where the hyper design comes in, for bootstrapping, Ethereum is equally as important, if not more important, because Ethereum allows us to bring tooling, infrastructure, UX improvements, things that make Web3 usable, that make DeFi usable, take what's already there, work with some of the best teams in the space to collaboratively design products that can then make Bitcoin more useful. So arguably, it's hard to pick a winner, and that's why we're a hybrid. But for us, it's really bootstrapping and getting started and leveling the playing field between the usability and things you can on Ethereum and Bitcoin, leveling the playing field, and then start growing, leveraging Bitcoin superpowers.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that you mention this kind of brand that Bitcoin has. If you were to go back to 2021, maybe even 2022 and before, there was the toxic Bitcoin maxi. So as you're building in the Bitcoin space and you're leveraging this kind of programmability that Ethereum and EVM programming provides, are you running into these headwalls of toxic Bitcoin maxis? Are you starting to see a new class of Bitcoin hodler? Or maybe there was even a silent majority that was there that wasn't toxic, and now you're kind of able to reach them?
I mean, I like the last thing you said, that there was a silent majority that wasn't toxic. I think that was always the case. I mean, how do you define a Bitcoin maxi? I'm a Bitcoin maxi. I've been working on Bitcoin for 10 years now. Does it make me a maxi? I mean, yes, I've always worked on Bitcoin, but always then, or very often, on the intersection of Bitcoin and other networks, because we always saw the value of expanding, looking beyond what Bitcoin has today and learning from other ecosystems and trying to combine these things, be it with bridges, be it with building like cross-chain protocols. So I used to be one of the people that would get uninvited from some of the Bitcoin Maxi conferences because we're doing a bridge. It really depends. I was also like spent some years doing a PhD, and as a researcher, you could sneak in and they'd tell you, oh yeah, you're a researcher, fine, do your thing, explore. You'll come back to Bitcoin eventually, which we did. And suddenly now it flipped, right? Now it's like BitVM is the hottest thing, and everybody is like super excited about it. The L2s are everywhere. Yes, there's also more nonsense, but that's part of essentially a renaissance, right? You have more innovation. Not everything makes sense. You also get grifters, but that's just part of a growing ecosystem. That's when things are moving. You get both sides of the coin. So I think over the years, we've had a lot of encounters with Bitcoin maxis, and what I experienced personally, and with a lot of my friends who worked in Bitcoin early on the research side specifically, there was so much headwinds to innovate, to propose changes to Bitcoin was scrutinized upon. Like, how dare you? Like, that's not okay. Would even get to a point where academic papers that asked for a Bitcoin soft fork became like irrelevant. I mean, in all fairness, by now, if you're asking for if your new thing works with Bitcoin, if it requires a fork, it's probably also no longer relevant. Like, it doesn't really happen. So a lot of people left. A lot of people went to build on other things. If you think of Celestia, Mustafa used to work on Bitcoin. Emin Günsarov and Avalanche started with Bitcoin. And there's more, like there's dozens of examples like this. I mean, the most famous Vitalik, he started with Bitcoin, right? And it's fine, right? It's okay to go experiment somewhere else and then come back to Bitcoin and try to apply the learnings and lessons learned, because Bitcoin is essentially this bastion that protects everything else and like gives us this alternative to the dollar or to a centralized financial system. However, to come back to your question, recently, for the last year and a half, maybe 2 years, we've seen a shift. And the shift stems from years and years of work, right? It took us a long time to get here. It's not that it's like sudden. It feels sudden to somebody who is observing this from the outside. That Bitcoin was silent, this rock, and suddenly it can do NFTs out of nowhere. And people are super excited. Everybody wants an ordinal, and everybody wants BRC20s, and then there's runes. And suddenly you have this massive community of people that's super excited, and we're talking about Bitcoin forks again, and now there's a list in the Bitcoin wiki. There's a list of really collecting feedback on what's the next soft fork, which is fascinating. That would have been unthinkable 2-3 years ago, because these discussions didn't happen in public. And because the community wasn't as open and there wasn't so much demand for these things from the broader community. You always had a very strong core community in Bitcoin on the technical side, but public interest was subsiding. And there's two things, right? There is the shift in the community side, in the sentiment. You, I think, have an overall acceptance that Lightning is failing, that it does not fulfill its purpose as a payment system. There's a realization that people don't necessarily want to pay with Bitcoin yet, and that stablecoins have strong product market fit. There is a realization that Lightning has poor UX, something that was known from day one. There is realization that fighting everything else that is innovation doesn't work. And there's a realization that actually there was cult-like movement of the podcast mafia, as we like to call them, which basically turned this into a religion and talked only about hyper-Bitcoinization, and you should sell everything and everything else are shitcoins. And that just doesn't really work. It's the wrong approach to something that's meant to be open. Why is your use case better than my Bitcoin use case? It's meant to be usable for everything, right? Ideally, it's not illegal, and ideally we all do good things with it. So just carving out the illegal stuff because nobody wants that. But still, like, what's illegal in your country? What's illegal in my country? Am I allowed to send you money? So that cultural shift was very important. And it started, or like got really, like, it started before ordinals. And then with ordinals, it really went hyperbolic because it's so approachable. Everybody knows NFTs. You can do them on Bitcoin. It's also a good narrative because you're actually storing the data on Bitcoin. You're taking something that you think is valuable, some digital art, and you're putting it onto the most expensive, most secure database in the world. And in parallel, we got BitVM and staking. So in parallel, you have like two new technical innovations Interestingly, both go back to Robin. So Robin came up with stick chains and then BitVM. So deserves actually quite a bit of credit on the technical side. And these things became possible through the Taproot upgrade. So if we trace back, everything was actually the Taproot upgrade that achieved something that it wasn't meant to do. But nobody expected ordinals. Nobody expected BitVM after Taproot.
Like, I can't overstate how incredible it's been to see this growth and building within the Bitcoin ecosystem. It's one of the reasons why I've been working in an alt L1 ecosystem since 2018, basically, because there's only so far that lifting weights and eating steak will take you as a community. And, denouncing the US dollar and the Federal Reserve, okay, that's a great point, but how is that going to carry me for years and years and years? And how am I going to onboard my dad with that argument? So it's kind of phenomenal to hear your background in the Bitcoin ecosystem. And I kind of want to hone in on that real quickly. So maybe you can just kind of give us the genesis story of the first time you came across Bitcoin. And did it click for you immediately? Or do you also have the second part of your tale where there was an aha moment where you're like, this is where I need to be?
So I heard about Bitcoin pretty early on. I was studying computer science. Naturally, it came up. And I remember finding it interesting, but didn't really pay attention too much. People mention it, you hear about it. I was really interested in IT security. Always found the aspect of privacy and censorship resistance pretty exciting, and was kind of zeroing in that domain. And initially my bachelor thesis was supposed to be on obfuscating Tor traffic behind Skype traffic. So you could use Tor, but your ISP wouldn't see because it looks like you're using Skype. And of course, if you start researching Tor, what's the main use case? Well, Silk Road pops up. And at the same time, the supervisor was also from the same research lab. I think actually, I keep telling the story, it's the same. It's actually another person that was offering the other topic, was offering research topics on Bitcoin, and I naturally got really excited and dove in. And the interesting bit is it wasn't Bitcoin, it was Namecoin. That got me really excited. So Bitcoin makes sense. Payments, interesting. Finance, interesting. Oh, but here's an altcoin, the first one that has Bitcoin security through merge mining, and it's actually targeted at censorship resistance, a better DNS. That I found super interesting. And that kind of, from then, it was really a random walk. I looked into merge mining because I realized Namecoin failed. What? Because everything was squatted. All the names had been bought up. Why? Oh, because merge mining, people were getting these free coins. They couldn't sell them really in the market. They didn't know what to do. So it was just buying domains. So what's merge mining? Well, it's the first way to actually do cross-chain interactions between two chains for security. And from there, it went to bridges and ultimately I ended up doing a PhD at Imperial College, also by pure coincidence. Was there when the position opened. It was funded by blockchain.com. And the initial goal was to work on Lightning. So I spent some time looking into that. Wasn't too excited just because it's so complex. And I had a hard time imagining retail users being able to really follow and understand. And if you remember the original Lightning paper, it was hard to read, but for someone who is new, a Web2 user trying to, remember how these things work, and I need to be online now and I need to trigger this. You can abstract the complexity fully, but then you're custodial again. And then I really started working on Bitcoin sidechains and bridges. So how do we actually bring Bitcoin to other networks? How do we create something that has Bitcoin security potentially? Or if we cannot easily do that, how do we bridge it to other things like Ethereum? And we designed trust minimized Bitcoin bridges. We proved that bridging is actually impossible. So my PhD was supposed to be on trustless Bitcoin bridges or trustless bridges. The result was, it doesn't work. You always need to trust someone. So quite disappointing result, but we proved it at least. But here is a ton of solutions how you can actually get it done in practice using game theory. You need to trust someone, but this could be anyone. This could be you, me, anyone in the network, or it could be someone who's actually collateralized. So if slashable. So if they have some stake, and if they misbehave, they lose their money. So things like that. And you see a lot of this ultimately is reflected in the Bob design and the things we've been doing over the last couple of years, also then in the product side.
About 2 years ago, I went on a campus tour here in the US to about 9 different universities, and I met with blockchain clubs all around the US to speak with students about building careers in crypto, blockchain, Web3. And I kept thinking as I was meeting these 18, 19, 20-year-olds, I will be shocked if you actually graduate because you're building a product right now. And you might just go by the way of like all our favorite Silicon Valley founders and drop out to work on your project. You have your PhD in computer science. So you've gone through bachelor's, you've gone through your master's, you've gone through the PhD course. Do you find that having that high level of education in computer science has been able to propel or spring the work that you do forward? Or was it kind of like, I'm on this path and damn it, I'm going to finish and get my piece of paper?
So for me, it was a bit different. So I had no computer science education before my bachelor's, right? So at school, we didn't really have that. I was interested. I was doing some stuff of my own, but it wasn't as easy to learn these things. It wasn't as accessible back in 2012. You could do it, right? But, I took a course at university in my last school year to just, learn some coding. And then I got really interested. And then for me, it was okay, like this is me like really getting a computer science education, really learning how to code, really getting really good at it. And when I discovered Bitcoin, it kind of like the PhD just happened. And the decision for me was, okay, people were starting to get interested in the topic. I started working on Bitcoin after the crash back like to, I think, $100 something, and people were saying it was dead, it was gone, it's dead, ruined, it's gonna die. Why are you spending your time on this? Like my parents were frustrated, like, what is this? What are you doing? Online casino stuff. And the PhD happened because it felt like the best way to work on this topic in a meaningful way and have impact and really develop solutions that made this better. And it was with an industry insight because it was funded by one of the biggest companies or most well-known companies in the space back then with blockchain.com. And at the same time, I had opportunities to go and work for like consultancy businesses that were selling blockchain to their customers. And when I looked at what they were selling, that was really had nothing to do with Web3 essentially, right? It was super early on. Now it's very different. Right now, people have realized that Ethereum's a thing, and you have like enterprise solutions that might make sense, sure. But back then, it was like it didn't really make sense. And so for me, the PhD was not like, okay, I'm going to get my degree and like I'm going to call myself a doctor. It was more like, okay, I get to do research, I have funding, I have access to someone who, like a company that's really well positioned in the space. Great, that's a unique opportunity. And then basically 1.5 years into the PhD, I mean, Dominic, my co-founder there, we were in the same lab. We were the first two PhDs that focused on cryptocurrency actually at Imperial College. And we kind of were like, okay, we actually want to build this stuff. Like, theory is nice, but it kind of feels wrong because you come up with the idea, you write the paper, you go submit, like you submit peer review to a peer review conference, you get accepted, publish the paper, you go present, and then you're done. It just stops there. And if I look back and if I compare to a startup life cycle, basically it's the same thing. You've just raised money and then you just stop before things get exciting, before you actually get to build it. So we started kind of looking for ways to spin out. And after 2 years into the PhD, we created a company. And we dropped out for a while. We had at that point completed most of our research requirements. So like you have to publish a certain amount of like top tier papers to be able to qualify and then get the degree. And we basically started working on the business and building bridges for things like Polkadot and working also on the research side with Cosmos. And we negotiated with a bunch of the big L1s for the Bitcoin bridging side. And we realized that, okay, well, it doesn't really scale that much because, doing only consultancy isn't super interesting. And then we really went to run this as like a product and like approaching business from that side. So the PG naturally led to the company. I wouldn't say that it really kind of gives me massive advantages in this space. It does help with things like BitVM and designing highly complex systems that should be secure, because having this understanding of distributed systems and how to prove security, how to really approach this from like a proper like first principles design standpoint helps a lot. Does it make me more qualified? Absolutely not, right? There's so many people out there that have no degree and they're so much more qualified in Bitcoin than I am. And I look up to these people. So I would really say it's optional. And it's nice to some extent, but you won't see me going around and see, oh, I have a PhD title, I'm better at this than you. It's like, that's not how it works in the space.
Yeah, it sounds like you had kind of a golden opportunity with blockchain.com. And it was really a nice cushion to kind of keep building, especially pre 2021. I mean, I got into the space in 2017, 2018, I went full time, and that bear market was brutal. So doing anything you can have to kind of survive and keep building and pushing forward is just a really great way to kind of stay in this industry. So you've mentioned a few times in our conversation BitVM. So I'm curious, is Bob possible without BitVM?
Well, yes, it is possible without BitVM, but can we get a Bitcoin fork instead, right? BitVM is, I think, a culmination of a lot of work that has been done in Bitcoin before. And I have to admit, like, I spent years working on bridges, and I don't think I would have seen that you can design the system that way. So Robin deserves all the credit for really coming up and spending the time of like experimenting until he came up with a mechanism. But if we zoom out and like to answer your question, what is like, we need to understand what BitVM is. BitVM is a way for us to execute smart contracts on Bitcoin. But Bitcoin, right, the assumption is always Bitcoin doesn't have smart contracts. Well, that's actually not true. Bitcoin has smart contracts. So Bitcoin has a scripting language. And in theory, you can write any program, arbitrary programs using that language. The problem is that something that's like 5 lines of code in Solidity is 1,000 lines of code in script, because you just have to write everything yourself. Think of it this way, like multiplication. When you code, you just write multiply. In Bitcoin, it's like, I mean, I'm exaggerating, but you're like just adding things manually, which is just to exemplify how the thing is structured. So yes, we can write any program, but these things get so big that they don't fit into a block. And then we have two options. Like what we want to do with Bob is we want to allow you to deposit Bitcoin into a side system that has Bitcoin security and always withdraw as long as Bitcoin security holds. So for this, we need to be able to verify that Bob has finalized on Bitcoin, right? The Bitcoin security we can get with or without BitVM. There's different mechanisms, some better, some worse. At the core of the system is the bridge. Within Bitcoin's scripting language, we have to verify that, hey, there was a transaction on Bob that says Alexei is withdrawing his wrap BTC back to Bitcoin. Let's make sure he gets them, and nobody else can get them. And that needs to be executed on Bitcoin and verify that it was done correctly. And that doesn't work in Bitcoin today because, yes, we could write these programs. We could take a snark verifier, right? The first thing you do is you take these complex programs, you compress them into a snark, which is like constant in size, it's compact, still too big, a gigabyte in script, right? Bitcoin blocks are 4 megabyte in size at most, so it really doesn't add up. And so we have two options then. We can introduce a fork and add more functionality to Bitcoin, and that basically compresses these programs. We require less lines of code and we might be able to fit it in. It'd still be expensive. Or we use BitVM, which says, let's take these things off-chain, run them off-chain, and only do something on-chain if something goes wrong. So it's the equivalent of Arbitrum, essentially, but on Bitcoin. Now, would BitBob be possible without this? No. Like, we need one way or another to securely verify that deposits have been made and withdrawals have been made on the side system. And BitVM today is the only thing that is practical, the only thing that actually works. And I've spent many, many years trying to design bridges. We came up with other solutions that were game theory based, but very inefficient in terms of capital requirements. And BitVM has the right balance. It's not the simplest system there is, right? But it works provably, and it's a very good design that doesn't require forks. And we'll eventually get a soft fork, and any soft fork that we might get will help make BitVM even more efficient, even more practical, even easier to use. So we could do Bob without this, but it wouldn't be as good of a product, right? And I do think that Bitcoin L2s, the one thing they need to do is they have to allow you to use Bitcoin on them without introducing third-party trust assumptions. It's going to take time for us to get there because, sure, we'll have BitVM, we'll be ready next year. That's pretty sure by now. Like, we'll see prototypes end of this year, testnets early next year, and the mainnets rolling out. How soon will billions of dollars move on to BitVM? That's going to take some time because the technical risk of a new system is always quite high. People are cautious, they should be, and many people will initially prefer institutional risk over technical risk. But the beauty of technical risk is it declines over time, whereas institutional risk tends to increase as people get corrupt when they make a lot of money, or regulations change or something like that. So yes, Bob needs BitVM. BitVM is already there, but we could also do it better if we had forks on Bitcoin. But I wouldn't bet on a fork. I wouldn't bet my business on a fork happening in the next 6 months. Let's put it this way.
When we talk about trustlessness and levels of decentralization, there's always trade-offs, and decentralization is a spectrum. It's not the end-all be-all. If you look at like Ethereum L2s, the sequencer networks, you could have a completely decentralized, optimistic sequencer network, but you're not getting finality for a week. Or you could have, in Base's case, centralized sequencer in Coinbase, but you have to completely trust the third party to verify that the transactions end up on the L1's state. So, what were some of the trade-offs that you guys had to conceptualize, and what were the exercises of the trade-offs of trustlessness for the bridging solution that Bob uses? And where did you end up, and why did you end up using that solution?
What we often hear is that Bob has a pragmatic approach to building products. I think ultimately it's very important to be highly opinionated about how the world should look like and what the future should look like. And that's why we have our hybrid design vision, where we clearly outline, okay, Bitcoin security, Bitcoin bridge, but then also trust minimized bridges from Ethereum and later from Solana and all the other big L1s that are secured by Bitcoin, replacing the need for centralized exchanges ultimately, if this hopefully works over time and we can replicate the network effects, because the assumption is right. There's one thing we all trust, and that Bitcoin is secure. Let's use that as the basis assumption rather than having to go to centralized exchanges. But to get there and to build and have the opportunity to build for that time, like for really iterating on the product and growing to be able to really have the trust of users to use things like BitVM and at scale, you have to be pragmatic. And this also means realizing that, as mentioned before, right now people prefer institutional risk on the Bitcoin side. Bitcoin is highly institutionalized. There'll be a lot of institutions that want to use Bitcoin. You can choose to exclude them or you work with them. And if you think about it, people use Base. Why do people use Base? Because they trust Coinbase. Should that be the reason they use Base? Probably not. But you also have to be realistic. That is the reason why they use Base. So you have to offer people solutions and allow them to start using Bitcoin now, and then work with them to gradually improve the product. Like, I don't think it makes sense for me to say, okay, I'm going to work on BitVM for 2 years, and then I'm going to release a BitVM bridge that is super secure, but nobody can use it for 2 years. Nobody really cares. And then I don't really know what people want. Do people really want to use it that way? Or maybe I misunderstood how people will be using Bitcoin and DeFi, and the way I've designed the bridge is completely useless now. Because maybe I made it non-fungible because it's easier, more secure, but non-fungible Bitcoin and DeFi where you cannot mix them and send them around doesn't work. So there's like these kind of pitfalls that you might miss if you just, lock yourself in your room and only work on the tech. So I think it's really important to accept that today things are centralized. And yes, we want to go from 0 to 1, but it doesn't work that way with changing user behaviors. You can't force people to change how they behave, how they interact with Web3 wallets, especially how they are used to using neobanks, for example. And you have to meet the users where the users are and take them by the hand and show them what's possible. And that means finding the right balance between security and transparency, but also usability. And so for Bob, when we look at the solutions we have today, we support a variety of different Bitcoin bridging solutions. We have TBTC, which is currently the most decentralized and robust BTC bridge, which uses essentially simplified MPC or threshold signatures, right? They have 30 plus signers. I think they're actually more by now, that are globally distributed and you don't know who they are and they're rotating, and that's a really good design. But then you also have WBTC, you have SolveBTC, you have FBTC, which are institutional solutions that are custodial, but they also have MPC multisigs in the background, but they're run by companies. Yes, you trust the business. Is that what we ultimately want in 10 years from now? No. Is that something that allows people to access Bitcoin today and show them how to use DeFi? Yes. And then you can choose. And who am I to prescribe to the user and force them to use only one Bitcoin bridge solution? Our goal is to find new use cases and make Bitcoin more useful. So the way Bob is rolling out is gradually. So we support a variety of Bitcoin bridge solutions right now, and we're working on BitVM. While we work on BitVM, on the research and development side, and that's the technical research team, on the product side, we work on making Bitcoin DeFi more accessible. So we realize that UX, just like trust, is a big burden on Bitcoin DeFi users. It's a hurdle. It's hard to get in. What we did is we built something we call Bob Stake, which is a one-click Bitcoin staking product. It's an SDK and a portal, and allows you to take your Bitcoin and deploy it into a variety of different Bitcoin DeFi solutions, be it staking through Babylon, liquid staking, where you can then use it in DeFi, opening DeFi vaults, lending a Bitcoin out, borrowing against it, supplying into DEXs, doing more complex strategies, as much risk as you want to take or as little risk you want to take. But all abstracted, all the complexity of picking one of 10 different bridging interfaces, picking one of 10 different DEXs, navigating their interfaces, that all is abstracted behind a single Bitcoin transaction. You make a transaction on Bitcoin, you're done. You have your position, you can withdraw without a transaction, and you're happy. And that's already live on mainnet. And that process itself, like going from Bitcoin to whatever asset, that is trustless. It doesn't introduce any additional trust assumptions. Of course, you do trust whatever wrap Bitcoin or like DeFi project you're using, but people want to use Bitcoin and DeFi. We see that there is demand and people don't want to wait for another 10 years. And you have to find the solution people are comfortable with, give them the chance to educate themselves, provide them the information of, okay, what are the risks associated? This might be a centralized solution. If you're trusting the company that's operating this, you're good to go. But this way, you make it accessible and you give people the choice. And that's something we don't have on Bitcoin today. You have that on Ethereum, on Solana, and so on. And arguably not all of these, only a very small part of these solutions is actually fully decentralized. But on Bitcoin, we always obviously aim for the highest standards. And unfortunately, if you only aim for something that might be possible and super secure in 5 years, but isn't usable now, people are just going to go somewhere else. And Bitcoin is going to miss out on a lot of the innovation. But then again, you need the users. You need the feedback to actually build a secure solution for the users, for the use cases they want. And that's why for us, it's gradual. We work with Bitcoin bridges today, make sure you can easily onboard. And then at the same time, we work on BitVM, and then we'll offer this in parallel. We'll make BitVM also accessible through one click. One of the motivations of building Bob Stake is actually that to use BitVM without running extra software, you'll need something like this for retail users. And then eventually, as people gain more trust and build their trust in BitVM and then this bridging technology that is really trust minimized, like nobody can steal your Bitcoin. But it could break because it's new tech and new code and so on. But as time progresses and you have more people using it, people will switch. Why? Because if it's as usable as everything else, and it's secure, and it's built in a way and integrated into products that people really want to use because we've worked with them closely and understood what they want, then people will use the more secure solution.
So you've mentioned several times through our conversation today that BitVM is going to enable and empower these levels of decentralization for Bob. And you've also mentioned that we won't really start seeing BitVM projects roll out until next year. So can you maybe just like Eli 5 or elevator pitch, or maybe just from a 10,000 foot view, explain where BitVM is in its development cycle and why maybe it's taking, I don't want to say so long for projects to launch using BitVM, but maybe what the security protections are so that people are kind of being slow to rolling out projects leveraging BitVM.
So the current state of BitVM is that you have an open source repository. The core system of BitVM works. And now what's being done is building tooling support for it and building the actual bridge protocol. You could take a snark, you can plug it into Bitcoin, and you can verify whether that thing was correct. That per se works, but there is more to it, right? There is using that to build a bridge, the client software, making sure that the operator software is ready, that the challenger software is ready, so people can actually challenge this easily, making that easy to run, so you can have a lot of people running this in parallel, like when they interact with the L2s. So you have a high chance that there will be someone online, and you only need one person, but someone has to be online to actually trigger a challenge if something goes wrong, right? Just like on ETH L2s. You have to also audit these things. You have to battle test. So right now we're at a stage that prototypes, we're like on this prototype stage. You'll see testnets by end of year. You have some early testnets now, like end of year, you'll see BitVM on testnet, most likely, maybe early next year, but that's kind of the current state. In parallel, there is also a lot of work on the design side. What people don't yet understand is BitVM doesn't solve the bridging problem itself. What BitVM allows us to do is to create a like client to like client bridge, or a bidirectional like client bridge. What does that mean? It means that if you have two chains, chain one verifies the minting on Bitcoin. Let's say the sidechain verifies that you've locked your Bitcoin on the Bitcoin main chain, and then it mints the wrapped Bitcoin. And then when you go back, Bitcoin through BitVM verifies that you've burned the wrapped Bitcoin, and then make sure you get it back. So you have these light clients that verify the chains. That's the most secure way to build Bitcoin bridges. That's the only trust minimized way you can build a bridge in general. The only thing you need is someone to submit these proofs. Now, getting that done, and the design is basically there in the paper, but then there's nuances and, okay, how does a light client look like? And that depends on how the sidechain looks like. Is it L2 that inherits security through being a rollup on Bitcoin? Or is it merge mining? Or is it staking? Or is it maybe Ethereum? But then for Ethereum, building a light client for Ethereum doesn't really work. So, okay, you run into issues there. If you want to do it for Cardano or Polkadot, well, you might also run into issues because these things potentially are not as easy to work with, or it's different cryptographic primitives. And just on the code side, you have to add a lot of new things to be able to support this within BitVM. So that's one thing that you need to do. And that's where the research is happening right now. How do we make sure that we have the secure light clients so we can build the secure bridges? And then you need to actually build a product layer on top, make sure that it's usable. That's already progressed. That's what we've already done. So we kind of have that part solved. And if you think about, like, for comparison with Ethereum, right? ETH took 5 years plus before you actually had real rollups. Bitcoin's going to be much, much faster, because also Ethereum did a lot of the initial research work. Like, we know how rollups work, we know the properties, we know what doesn't work. So Bitcoin is kind of, I would say, halfway through that cycle that Ethereum has gone through, maybe even closer. We will see these things go live next year. So I wouldn't say it's slow. The BitVM paper came out a bit more than a year ago, and the original design wasn't practical. So BitVM 2, the one that actually works, came out in August. Now, and then you actually have to start counting from then, because that's when for the first time we're like, okay, you can build this, and this is actually going to work for a Bitcoin bridge. And then the last bit to mention is that using BitVM for full rollups is still a thing of research. It's not as straightforward to make that efficient, right? So you always have to deal with the question of the costs on Bitcoin. How much data do you post? How often do you post that? And there's still quite a few open research questions there. So my prediction is we'll see Bitcoin bridges that use BitVM on mainnet first. That will happen probably in the first half of next year with training wheels, right? But so these things will not launch without having fail safes initially. And then gradually towards the end of the year, I think people will start turning off the fail-safe if everything works well. And then in parallel towards the end of the year, you'll start seeing Bitcoin rollup-like construction come to the market.
If you had to make a spicy guess, you would say that maybe we have a super simple mainnet BitVM bridging solution available Q4 2025?
Well, define mainnet, right? I can launch something on mainnet, but would I tell you to put $1 million into it? I don't know. So the question is, I think a testnet, a pre-launch testnet, I think Q1, pre-audit, pre-mainnet testnet where you can actually go use it and it feels like a product, but then audits and gradual rollout with that happens. But look, again, our ETH rollups on mainnets, they're on mainnet, but how many of them have fraud proofs? How many of them have a multi-sig fail-safe? So I think the standards that Bitcoiners have for these things are very high and sometimes a bit too high in terms of product thinking. And again, if you're selling security, you shouldn't take shortcuts on one hand. On the other hand, if you want to build a product, you have to take shortcuts. So the approach here is be very transparent about what already works, what are the risks, what's here today, and what is being worked on. I think that's the doctrine that we have at Bob. We're very transparent about what works today and what we're working on and will be rolling out in the near future. Like, we're an ETH rollup today. Very simple. We don't have Bitcoin security yet. We are working on it, and we have a few really cool designs that are very unique and allow us to combine the two worlds. And I wish more teams would actually be honest about the state of things. But of course, that's not always in the interest of everyone on the marketing side. So I can highly recommend Bitcoin layers as the equivalent of L2 beat, but for Bitcoin L2s.
I appreciate that you called out the length of time that it took for rollups on Ethereum to kind of come to fruition after conceptualization 5 years, and that there were a lot of lessons that BitVM and Bitcoin L2 developers have kind of leveraged from that research that went into those scaling solutions. Have we seen any sort of like bi-directional relationship? Have EVM-based rollups learned anything from BitVM yet? Has BitVM uncovered anything that can help these rollups in EVM land? Have we seen anything like that yet?
I don't think so. I don't think many people on the EVM side are fully aware of what BitVM is. No, I don't think we're at a stage where you'd go and say, look, hey, ETH rollup, you should learn from BitVM. Like, the trick of BitVM is making it work on Bitcoin. That's what it's all about. You don't have these problems on Ethereum. So the thing with BitVM is solving it for Bitcoin specifically. But solving it only for Bitcoin, it happens to be bigger than everything else. So it's like, I think there is a very good reason to actually solve this thing for Bitcoin. But ETH rollups did learn a lot from Bitcoin research, because a lot of the early research came from the Bitcoin community. That's where it all started. And then gradually Ethereum started becoming a powerhouse of ZK research as well. And of course took over at some point. But I think eventually, and I see this happening, Bitcoin will become the powerhouse of research and innovation again. If I just look at the amount of papers and research being published and released over the last year compared to the years before that, and we call it the innovation heartbeat, and it's really accelerating, and it's really, really great to see again.
So Bob launched in May of this year, and there's a hefty amount of TVL that's in the ecosystem. So can you maybe just share, maybe even take a moment to show the success that Bob has seen in being able to aggregate this TVL? What have been some of the lessons learned? Who of these users that have been using Bob and using their Bitcoin, who have they been? Are they just like dormant Bitcoin holders, or are they degens from Ethereum? I would just love to hear your insights.
So Bob launched early in May this year, and since then we've come quite a long way. So we have seen a lot of users try out the platform and actually also come back. If we were to drop some stats, we've seen 320,000 unique users interact with Bob. If you count wallets, it's around 400,000 if you're actually interested in the unique users, of course. We've reached $250 million in DeFi TVL. We have more liquidity that's currently on chain and gradually evaluating, experimenting with the different solutions. I think the latest number is 450 million. But again, I'm always cautious saying these numbers, because if the Bitcoin price goes down, it changes. If it goes up, it changes. So I think it matters, because it shows that people are starting to trust the ecosystem, that it also validates a lot of our assumptions around what people want to do with their Bitcoin. And I think some of the most exciting things are Bitcoin liquid staking products. So where we, for the first time, and even if it's still early, right, and there is no real staking rewards return yet, because the things are not fully live, the fact that people are so excited about it even now just validates that there is demand. And if you look at the Bitcoin staking market today, the Babylon cap just went live. Babylon previously was sitting around $2 billion, right? It's going to grow. And if you compare that to Ethereum liquid staking, which sits at what, 46, 47, 48, $50 billion, and then you extrapolate, comparing this, like factoring in the size of Ethereum, the size of Bitcoin staking could be a $200 billion market. That's very big. That's, of course, assuming that we manage to activate that dormant liquidity, but we see the early signs of that, and we see the early signs of that on Bob as well. And the interesting bit is that early signs on Bitcoin already means that you're pretty big, which is fascinating, right? That's why if you win on Bitcoin, you don't just win in Bitcoin, you win the entire market, because Bitcoin is just bigger than everything else. It's also why it's so hard. Like if you have to have patience. If you rush things, Bitcoin is going to chew you up and spit you out, right? So it requires time to also build trust with these users. And also like it just validates some of our assumptions and just shows like how Bitcoin liquidity behaves. Trust matters a lot. And like if you look at the apps on Bob, Uniswap is the largest in TVL. In fact, Bob is the number 5 Uniswap deployment in size. And people just prefer to supply liquidity there than anywhere else because they trust Uniswap. And you can really see the difference between like Uniswap on Bob and other L2s where often like some native DEX is doing better because in this, like the user base is different, right? Like Bitcoiners and Bitcoin holders and just even DeFi users treat their Bitcoin differently than they treat their ETH and they treat their Sol and their other coins. Bitcoin is this thing that you don't want to lose. You're careful with it. You're just, it's so indoctrinated in everyone's minds that you have to be cautious. So that's an interesting observation. Yeah. So, and then otherwise, I think one of the exciting things that we've been able to achieve is the launch of Bob Stake, this one-click Bitcoin staking aggregator that really abstracts away this complexity. If we were to draw a technical buzzword, it's the first ever instance and implementation of Bitcoin intents. So what you see on Ethereum now also exists on Bitcoin. We also have smart accounts for Bitcoin. So the things that you usually see on Ethereum and then Bitcoin will take like 10 years to follow, now suddenly we're getting them on Bitcoin in the same cycle, which is actually quite exciting. And we're also very, of course, proud in this case that we're able to contribute to this new development, I guess, that Bitcoin is suddenly no longer 10 years behind on these things. So yeah, and then there we've actually had wallets announce that they're integrating the staking aggregators, institutional staking providers, some very big institutional custodians that we're working with as well. So all in all, very exciting. For Bob, it's a lot of lessons learned, a lot of interesting observations of how people interact with the platform, which things work, what doesn't work, things that people really want, like getting Bitcoin out of the system, being able to unstake quickly, for example, is a feature request that we've seen very frequently, but also being able to deploy Bitcoin not only on Bob, but also cross-chain. So yeah, it's been very, very busy, and we have a lot more in store for next year.
I'm going to be interviewing Fisher from Babylon this week, actually. So this interview and Fisher's is part of a Bitcoin Builders ecosystem kind of series we're doing for the Smart Economy podcast. And for those who aren't familiar, Babylon is a non-custodial staking architecture. Are there any other protocols or architectures that are on Bob's radar right now that you guys are really excited to dig into and to support? Is there anything like that you're keeping your eye on?
I mean, there's a lot, but then also with a caveat that once you have BitVM, you basically can do anything with Bitcoin that you see on Ethereum DeFi today. But having said that, we're still very interested in things like better Bitcoin multisigs, right? Like why would a Bitcoin L2 want a native Bitcoin multisig, right? Well, if you think about it, can you name me a Bitcoin multisig today? Like a really successful one? No. If I asked you, can you name me the top 5 on Ethereum, you'll probably only know Genesis Safe because that's the biggest one, right?
Yeah.
And we've supported a team called Coffer Network that's been actually working on building a better Bitcoin multisig that actually is designed to integrate smart accounts early on, so you can go from your cold storage to your deployments on DeFi and Bitcoin L2s, and you can go back and forth. So you have the same key management, same interface for your cold storage and your hot deployments, but they happen to be in a Genosis multisig, so also actually quite secure. So that is something that we're super excited about, and this kind of infrastructure that really makes it easier to use Bitcoin. We've seen Bitcoin-backed stablecoin designs that use, like on the economic and product side, but also on the technical innovation side that try to use things like DLCs or things that try to do Bitcoin-backed loans, so lending protocols. And I have to admit, because we work on BitVM, like technical solutions that are alternatives are interesting. We love exploring them. But ultimately, what we really look for and we're really excited about are the products, things that make this more accessible. Because we have the infrastructure, right? We have trusted lending protocols, lending markets. We have DEXs like Uniswap on Bob. We have on and off ramps. We can make it super easy for you to deploy Bitcoin. into these DeFi protocols. So what we're really excited about are distribution channels. How do we make this accessible to different user groups? The tech is there, and how do you package this as a product? And what products do people want? How do they want to use their Bitcoin? Do they want to go long short, or do they just want to stake it and not touch it? Do they want a DCA? Would people take loans against Bitcoin, microloans? Would they use this with credit cards? So that's the kind of thing that we're really looking into and are super excited about, because it takes a certain skill to really work with local audiences and build local businesses. And that is also, I think, one of the superpowers of Bitcoin, that there are so many local communities that have very different problems and very different approaches to solving them, but Bitcoin is still somewhere at the core. And that's what we're actually trying to support, and talk to as many of these teams as possible to see, okay, can we make your life easier? You were previously trying to solve this with Lightning and DLCs. Well, look, we actually have a solution that makes it easier, and you get stable coins, and you get exchange on and off ramps, and you get smart accounts, so you can onboard your users with their email and not force them to note down their 12-word C. But of course, they can also go full self-custody afterwards. So as you can see, like, we're moving more towards the product side. I love infrastructure, I love the tech, but I love products even more.
So kind of zooming out and wrapping up, I know you just mentioned that you love products, but Bob is currently in phase 1 of a 3-phase rollout. The first phase is bootstrapping as basically an Ethereum L2, which is now done. So what are the next 2 phases, and can you just share a little bit about what users can expect?
Of course. So in phase 1, as mentioned, bootstrapping as an ETH rollup. We get best-in-class infra. We make sure we have all the tools. There's no difference between building on Bob Base or Optimism in terms of tooling, infrastructure support, right? You don't have to worry about that. You can focus on what matters, meaning the Bitcoin side of things. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. And here we really focused on Bitcoin into DeFi deployment, so making that accessible. And then in phase 2, we add Bitcoin finality to the ETH rollup. So this means that on top of checking for fraud proofs on Ethereum, on the L1 contract of Ethereum, we would also check for Bitcoin finality. Now, we're integrating a finality gadget for this. There is multiple ways of doing that. We'll be releasing some information on this actually next week. So depending on when this podcast airs, this information might be out or not. And that will allow us actually to then have Bitcoin security on top of the ETH rollup. And with this, we will then also build and get to production the BitVM bridge that allows us to then deploy Bitcoin into Bob. And that bridge will use that Bitcoin finality as security anchor, which is actually one of the only ways to make BitVM fully practical with Bitcoin security right now in the next couple of months. And then in the final phase, so in phase 2, what we have is an ETH roll that has Bitcoin finality and a trust minimized Bitcoin bridge. That's already pretty good. Better than the majority of things, almost everything on the market, if we're honest. Like, to attack Bob in phase 2, you have to attack Ethereum, you have to attack Bitcoin, or like the subset of Bitcoin operators and nodes that work on this finality side. That's already pretty hard. And then in phase 3, in the final phase, is when we will then move the settlement from Ethereum over to Bitcoin. So that's when BitVM turns from bridge to actual full settlement layer. That per se in theory is already possible. The problem are the data availability costs, right? If you want to do fraud proofs, you need the data. Posting data to Bitcoin is very expensive. Posting it somewhere else means you trust that something else and need to check that the data was actually posted to react on the Bitcoin side. And if you don't know whether the data was posted or not, you're kind of opening yourself up to the attack where the sequencer says, I'm not going to post the data, so you don't know what I'm going to do, and then I'm going to do something bad, and Bitcoin doesn't know about it. So solving that problem in an efficient way is the last missing piece on the research side. And you could have 2 ways of solving that. Tech, making it more efficient, or scale, being big enough so that you can spread the costs among sufficient users, so it's less than a cent per user per transaction. And then you're also fine. So that is essentially the final phase 3. Phase 2 will start rolling out in Q1.
Perfect. I kind of want to end this fascinating conversation with an existential question, especially for someone who's been in Bitcoin for 10 plus years. The crypto anarchists kind of touted the success of Bitcoin because it will inevitably replace a nation state's currency. But today we're seeing BlackRock, Fidelity, VanEck, accumulate massive amounts of Bitcoin. So we have this corporate overhaul of entities accumulating this asset. If you go onto crypto Twitter right now, you see people touting Russia and the US and other large-scale countries, even smaller countries, adding Bitcoin as a part of their national reserve. So do you think that we're at some sort of bizarre crossroads where we're touting corporates and governments to allocate resources to owning this asset? And is this good or bad for us?
That's a very interesting take. And I mean, it is a very interesting situation, right? I think it is, of course, controversial to some extent, where Bitcoin was supposed to replace the banks and now the banks are selling you Bitcoin. On the other hand, Bitcoin is many things, right? It's hard to predict what Bitcoin will end up being in 10 years from now. Where it seems to be heading is a global neutral asset. And if you look at our current geopolitical situation, there is reason, I guess, for nation states looking to acquire Bitcoin because they see that eventually there might be a multipolar state of the world. Might be, we don't know, right? But for the fact that there might be, Bitcoin is the one thing that actually is neutral. And even if, yes, some nation state is trying to buy it up, ultimately it is neutral. So I think it's Bitcoin's role in geopolitics, we shall see. But that it does come with interesting consequences for the Web3 community. In terms of making changes to Bitcoin, I think there is a very short window in which we could actually still make a fork before Bitcoin becomes so institutionalized that it's even slower to make changes. And yes, believe me, it can go even slower. And at the same time, I think there's also an opportunity for L2s. The flippening that I would like to see is that there's more Bitcoin on Bitcoin secured L2s with trust minimized bridges than in ETFs. So I think it's a double-edged sword. Yes, Bitcoin is going mainstream. Everybody gets to know Bitcoin. We are at the same time, we're seeing more chains that become accessible. So more people entering Web3, and there'll probably be like this moment of truth, right? Like, which way does it go? Do the banks win and just everybody stays with the banks and uses Bitcoin there? Or does Bitcoin win and everybody goes to Bitcoin because the banks onboarded them to Bitcoin? People accepted Bitcoin and then they started using Bitcoin themselves. That is to be seen. I'm obviously cautiously optimistic that with the UX improvements and with the developments that we've seen on Bitcoin in the recent months and last 2-3 years, we're in a very good trajectory to actually succeed at building platforms that allow you to use Bitcoin the same way you use it with banks, and that you don't need a bank to get Bitcoin. It's super easy to access. I mean, the fiat on and off ramp will always be a problem unless you build big enough scalable peer-to-peer markets, and that is already happening. So there is a risk. The flippening I want to see is more Bitcoin on L2s than on ETFs, but the clock is ticking. I definitely personally kind of start feeling the pressure, and maybe it's imaginary, maybe not, but the more Bitcoin banks buy, the less cypherpunk it might become in the next 5 years, meaning the less changes we can do to enable decentralized things to happen on Bitcoin that could challenge these banks.
Alexei, this has been a fantastic conversation. If anybody heard this and is psyched, who do you want to speak to and what's the best way they can reach out to you?
So you can always find me on Twitter. That's probably the easiest. I'm quite open and responsive in my DMs. I'd love to speak. If you're a Bitcoin user and you want to do more with your Bitcoin, I'd love to learn about, what is it and why. And if you don't want to do more with your Bitcoin, I'd also love to learn why not? Like, what are the things that make you concerned? Yeah.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy, hectic schedule, day, life, end of year. This conversation was amazing, and I can't wait to share it with the Smart Economy podcast listeners. So much thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Well, thank you so much for tuning in to the Smart Economy podcast. To stay in the loop with all of our episodes and insights, head over to www.smarteconomypodcast.com. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for all of our video content. If you enjoyed today's discussion, please consider showing your support by liking, commenting, and reviewing this episode on your favorite podcasting platform. Your feedback helps us reach more listeners, and bring even better content your way. We'd also love to hear from you, so please drop a comment on Spotify or YouTube to share what topics you would like us to cover and who you might like us to interview as our next guest. And if you or someone you know might make a great guest, please reach out. We're always looking for fresh voices and new perspectives. And for our NEO token holders, please consider voting for NEO News today as your council representative. We've proudly been serving the NEO ecosystem since 2017, and we'll continue to do so by putting portions of our council rewards directly back into ecosystem growth initiatives. With all of that said, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to the Smart Economy podcast, and we look forward to catching you next time.